everyone, and welcome to Disability Dish, the UML Perspective. My name is Janelle Diaz. I'm an Assistant Director in Disability Services. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm so excited to have our 5th episode with all of you listeners today. We have some great guests for you. I am a co-facilitator with my co-facilitator.
Hi, everybody. Jodi Rachins. I'm the Director of Disability Services. My pronouns are she, her, and we're excited to have you here. Hopefully you've listened before if you've tuned in, but on our 5th episode, I will just give you a little kind of about the mission behind our podcast. So a very big initiative for the Disability Services Office is to really utilize collective skills and knowledge that we have to just go beyond accommodations. We really want to openly and actively discuss ways in which we can support our fellow community members, whether it's within the university, outside networks, or just in everyday life. So it's important to have a major effort to reduce stigma and shame around disability. We really like to flip the script and highlight the uncountable strengths that can show through disabilities. So among the various initiatives that we are working towards, the podcast is one to really provide some representation and discussion around various interesting topics around disability.
And just a little disclaimer, this is just a discussion, conversation. These are our opinions and perspectives. There's no right or wrong answer. So with that said, we're going to start by having our special guest speakers introduce themselves. So whoever wants to kind of go first can definitely do so.
And we'll have you say your name, your role at the university, and your relationship with the word disability. And Bridget, you look like you were jumping in.
Sure, it's that awkwardness of who should we go alphabetically?
We shake off the awkwardness. It's always like a little awkward for a couple minutes and we shake it off. It's okay.
Okay, we'll shake off that awkwardness. Hi, I'm Bridget Marshall. I'm a professor in the English department here at UMass Lowell. I am so happy to be here. Thank you, Jodi and Janelle, for the invitation. And I love everything about the mission that Jodi just talked about. My own relationship to disability would be that I teach a course on disability and literature here at UMass Lowell that I designed back in 2007 when someone came to me and said, hey, we don't have a course related to this at all. This seemed, and I was just fascinated by the idea that we didn't have any course. We focus on so many different kinds of identities and ideas and concepts, and disability is a huge one that we can't overlook and is all too often overlooked. So it's a course I developed. I teach almost every fall semester and I love it. Janelle, oh, sorry, is it all right if I say that you were one of my students in that class at one point? So I'll be happy to talk about what I've done there, and thanks for having me.
I was going to say, everyone take the course. It was a great course.
Sounds awesome.
Thank you for the plug.
Well, I guess I'll go next. I'm Patrick. I am a rising senior at UMass Lowell, and I also work for transportation. And my relationship with the word disability is I have learning disabilities, so it's kind of been my life up until now. I live with a disability, so that's my relationship with the word, I guess.
Thanks, Patrick.
Oh.
Yeah, you over there.
I'm Noah right now. I'm sort of between my junior and senior year. I'm an English major, mainly focused on journalism and professional writing, and my relationship to disability is well, first off, how much time you got. I was born with Alport syndrome, which is a pretty rare kidney disease, so I ended up having to have a kidney transplant in 2019. I was on dialysis for about 6 months before then. That also, it causes my hearing and my eyesight to be pretty bad. Also, growing up, I I was diagnosed with both OCD and Tourette's syndrome. So yeah, I have
Got a relationship with disability.
yeah, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Noah. So today we're talking about identity and disability identity. And Janelle and I are really excited about this topic because there's so much to it. And we think we couldn't have a better set of guests to dig in with us. So, again, as I was joking, we'll shake off the awkwardness of like who talks and how that works out. But I just want to sort of start with opening, like, when you think of the word identity, like, how do you define it? What do we think that starts like?
I think identity is different for everybody, but I think in a disability context, I think it's kind of, hidden or visibility. And then it's also kind of like what makes you you. It's not like, I like to like, I'm not super open that like, I have ADHD and all that stuff, but I think I define my identity as something that's like part of me, but it's not something that makes me super different or, just something along those lines,
Yeah,
Hard to say, right?
Yeah.
I kind of agree with that as far as like, at least as far as disability goes. It's mainly that it's a part of you, but it isn't all of you. There's more than just that, obviously.
Yeah, identity is just such the huge umbrella term. And then there's so many different angles or lenses. There's a lot of different ways to sort of phrase like how you might think about how your gender, how your race, ethnicity, and disability, how all of those things and more, right, more aspects of your identity that come together to make up who you are to other people, who you are to yourself, like in your own mind, how you think of yourself. So I think there's sort of at least two parts to identity, which would be like how you see yourself and want to see yourself, and how other people outside you might see yourself. Sorry, can you edit that out, Janelle? That sounded bad. How people might see you from the outside.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
Go ahead, Noah.
I was just gonna say I sort of like how you mentioned that, because when I think of identity, I mainly think of things sort of that I guess things that make us us, meaning that like I feel like whether you're race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, that kind of thing, we don't really have much of a choice over that. But to me, or disability, you don't not really have a choice in that either. So usually, to me, it's more, I guess identity is more so, I guess, based off of who we are as a person rather than sort of these kind of non-factors. Because I mean, I think I don't really think any of those things that you don't really have a choice over, they don't really say who you are as a person. So like, I mean, they're important, they can be important parts of you for sure, but they you don't necessarily get to know someone just based on that.
I think what you're saying, Noah, and sort of goes into this, like, why is identity important construct, is sort of like, as humans, like we kind of naturally categorize everything around us. Like our whole world is split into this or that or the other thing, our whole brains just like list everything into categories. And so we do that with people too. And there are certain categories that help us sort of understand people. But your point around that like actually doesn't really give us everything we need to know to understand people is important to think about too, that there are categories that we can see or not see, but that doesn't necessarily make it a whole person in the end either. So yeah.
And just kind of further going off of that, you touched upon that, Jodi, about the society impacts, but how do you all believe society impacts how identity is perceived and or accepted?
I think growing up, it was interesting. It's kind of like why I'm actually excited to come on this today, and then why we created this kind of committee. And it's, my high school was a great high school, lots of funding, but there was still kind of this stigma around, you don't want to be friends with the kids who are in special education. And I think that definitely had a lot of kids not wanting to be associated in that room if they were. It was something that it was something they hid. They didn't bring up because they didn't want to be outcasted. So
That stigma piece.
Yeah. I went to a public elementary school, and then afterwards I went to private school. But my best friend from elementary school, he was in the special ed class, and he always sort of thought that made him stupid or something. And I felt really, he always felt like people thought he was stupid when that really wasn't the case. And like right now he is doing really, really well for himself. He has a job as an electrician. He's making a lot of money. And then, so, I mean, he's definitely a really bright guy, but yeah, it always sort of hurt to see him like feel that way, I guess.
So I'm hearing from kind of both of you is that at times identity can be perceived in a negative manner versus a positive manner. And sometimes we are not being accepted because of our identities.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
I'm curious where we think that idea stems from, where people think that they don't want to associate with somebody because they think they're stupid, or they think that there's something going on in the room, the special ed room or whatever. Like, what do we think that comes out of?
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure because I never really even knew what that was, I guess. So like I knew most of the kids in the special ed class, and they weren't really any different from the kids who, I guess you would say, in the regular classes. But like I said, my best friend was in the special ed class, so actually, if anything, I would have wanted to be in it too because he was there. As far as like when I was growing up, I don't really think there was any sort of stigma there. I mean, I think we sort of knew that class, I guess, was supposed to be different, but we didn't really understand why, and we didn't really care that much. So
yeah, I think there were some kids like that, but I think it has a lot to do with upbringing. Because there are some kids who just in general aren't very judgy. They're open to new friendships with anybody. Doesn't matter what other people think of them. Like they'll always give kind of someone a chance, and there are other people who just shut you away because of who you are or how you identify, or stuff like that.
Dare I say, fear of the unknown.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what it all comes down to, as far as like if you look at things like, I guess, racism, a lot of it has to come from fear of the unknown. So like, if you don't, like for me, I remember when I was in, full disclosure, if you're listening to this, I'm white. I'm very white, but
Podcast description. Thanks.
yeah, there were these two brothers who started going to my elementary school, I think in first grade, and they were black. And I actually thought it was cool that their skin color was different from mine. Like, that was the only thing I realized. I didn't have, I mean, I noticed it. I feel like most people are able to notice that kind of thing, but I was rather than being sort of frightened by it, I actually thought it was interesting. And then even though they moved away like a couple of years later, I was friends with both of them. So
I think Jodi's point about fear is really important, unfortunately. Like, if we don't talk about, the other thing is it's a perpetuating thing where if we don't talk about disability, it becomes something that, oh, don't mention that. Don't look at that person because, well, they have a disability. We don't talk about that. And if you're not going to look at them, then you can't engage them and you can't have a conversation with them. And it sort of snowballs in that way. So I feel like, things like this where we're sitting around talking about disability, disclosing if we feel comfortable a disability, is a really positive step forward to sort of fight that stigma, right? And I see little kids all the time who they're curious about disability when they see someone with a physical disability or they see someone behaving differently. And some parents, I understand the urge, like, oh, don't do that, don't
point, don't stare.
Yeah. And Janelle, we've talked about this in class before, right? That I understand the instinct. I know in general the parent means well there, but a better thing to do is to navigate and talk with your kid before you encounter someone with a disability would be a really good thing to do as well. And to get kids out and seeing more people and connecting with more people, having schools that are more integrated in all sorts of ways that Noah just brought up as well, right? Where you are going to encounter people who look different than you, who behave different ways, and that's a good thing, that you can remove some of that fear and hopefully dial back that stigma, because otherwise it just grows and continues, and you have people just creating really negative cycles in terms of fear and stigma and perpetuating that with younger kids as well.
Yeah, to just go off of that, a lot of that is sort of pushed on people by their parents from a very young age. So like the way I sort of look at things is lots of people, like, I don't really think anyone is born as a racist. They're sort of made that way by saying, like, if they have no experience being around other, I guess, people of other races, and their parents sort of force those sort of ideals on them, then they're going to grow up, most likely they're going to grow up to be that way. And I think it's up to, I guess, maybe people in general to sort of go against that kind of thing. And I'll admit, like, personally, like, it can be difficult at certain times, especially when it comes to disability is such a broad term. You could really mean anything from like being blind, being deaf, or like being physically impaired. And then because I spent a lot of time in the hospital, obviously, because of my medical problems, I would see people, or mostly children, who they would be severely disabled, like they'd be in a wheelchair, and then they couldn't even really speak coherently. They'd just make sounds. And when you see that kind of thing and you're not used to it, it can definitely scare you. Not that I think it should scare you. I'm just saying it will catch you off guard.
Yeah,
And
I think what you're all saying is something that comes up for me, and I have an almost 4-year-old who is a question asker, and so am in very early stages of trying to figure out like appropriate language to kind of label some of those tough questions. And some of those questions that Mr. Almost Four is asking is, you know, we drove by a cemetery the other day and wanted to know what that was and what are those sculptures? And, you know, and I was trying to kind of say like, those aren't sculptures. Let's talk about death a little bit in 4-year-old language. And, you know, and I make a really big effort to make sure that we're reading books where there's all different types of identities represented and having conversations and saying, yeah, why is she sitting there and there's wheels? And I say, well, you know what, those are so that they can help her move forward, and your legs help you move forward and her wheels help her move forward, and just trying to use really simplistic language, but to like give honor. But I think that like I've put a lot of like effort, and my husband reports that he has a harder time with those conversations because he also doesn't want to say the wrong thing, and I'm trying to have those conversations around like, well, you know, we can also make mistakes, and we can, you know, this feels like a theme every time we do this podcast. Like, the fear of making mistakes is sometimes the bigger thing of the fear of the unknown. It's like we might say something that we didn't really mean to say, and then it just opens a new conversation around like how to learn from that and say we're all growing, we're all making our best effort, you know. And so you know, there's a book that he wanted to know why there's only a mom in the book, you know. And so, you know, all these different conversations. And so I have kind of made a conscious decision as a parent that like I'm gonna try to use as much as a 4-year-old construct can handle. Like, we're going to talk about it. You know, this is normal, and let's normalize this. But it's not easy either. And it's not easy for me, but I try.
My dad used a wheelchair, and I remember vividly like some little kids that would be really freaked out by it, but then some kids who would be really curious about it. And my dad loved putting little kids on his like electric wheelchair and showing up, and there was like a horn kind of thing on it. There was this one kid who loved, and so he used it as a sort of way to connect in ways that were really, I watched as adults would be really taken aback by that, because they felt like, no, I need to stop my kid from doing this. But it was something for my dad that he felt, I mean, I think he was trying to destigmatize it and make it like, hey, it's not a big deal that I'm in this wheelchair, because it was a big deal that he was in the wheelchair. But it was something that was, and it's not going to be the case for everyone, but I think we need to allow the person with the disability to set the terms for that, right? We can't say that a person in a wheelchair needs to educate everybody who comes up to them, but we also can't just walk away or avoid or be afraid of either. That's these two extremes are both a problem.
I can definitely say I'm the cool aunt because of my wheelchair and my horn as well, Dr. Marshall.
You're definitely the cool aunt, Janelle.
But I think you bring up a good point in terms of trying to destigmatize the wheelchair in general. Like myself as a wheelchair user, you just kind of want to feel connected, and you want to be able to find a way to connect with people. Us as human beings are naturally wanting to connect with other individuals. So we work really hard to make those connections in whatever way that we can. And sometimes identity can come in the way of that if it's a visible identity that someone perceives as a negative one.
At the same time, don't touch anybody's wheelchair if they haven't expressly given you permission to do so. I don't want to suggest that anyone should be like throwing their kid over.
Best practices, yeah.
Also, this should go without saying, but if you ever watch a TV show where people use wheelchairs when they can actually walk, definitely don't do that in real life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of that episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where they all get on wheelchairs, and then
you bring up a good point though. There's this media component that, you know, we have had an episode on already, but it's going to always be talked about, is sort of we're exposed to media and we're exposed to the news, and how is disability identity being portrayed in positive ways and negative ways that help us form others, the kind of what Bridget was saying, like the identity that we think of others and our identity within ourselves. And, you know, that's a whole thing.
Well, yeah, I think things have definitely changed a lot over the years, especially recently. I feel like in the media, there has been a lot of destigmatization of various disabilities. So for example, like they'll have shows or movies about people with autism, or then the movie that just won the Oscar was about a deaf family.
Mhm.
And then watching that, people can realize, hey, these people aren't any different from us. They just have, like, oh, just because they can't hear doesn't mean they are any different from the rest of us.
Mhm.
So I think that sort of showing that kind of thing is very important. And I think, and even though maybe it isn't done as often as it should be, I feel like it's sort of, it used to be like they wouldn't do that kind of thing at all. So I feel like showing disability in media also in a way, like, I feel like it's not positive or negative. It's just neutral. It's just a part of it's, again, like I was sort of saying earlier, it's just a part of who a person is. It's not their whole personality. It's just, something about them, just one thing. And I think it's important that people can be shown that so they can realize it.
So I think you bring up a good point that we are making kind of greater strides in the media in terms of incorporating disability more. So fun fact, research states that 1 in 4 American adults have a disability, but that not all identify as being disabled. So what factors do you think lead to a person either identifying or not identifying as a person with a disability?
I think societal pressure is one of those. There's some people who, like myself, even, I always knew that I had learning disabilities and all that, but I didn't really want to go out and kind of everybody I met kind of tell them, oh yeah, like I have ADHD, or this is how it was in high school for me, because a lot of people will and have like pushed away because most people aren't very open, even when they say they do, or when they say they are. So I think a lot of people want people around them and don't want to give out information that might be true to them and how they identify, for fear of being kind of like left alone.
Yeah.
I think another factor is just how big the umbrella is that the term disability covers. So someone who uses a wheelchair, someone who is blind, and someone who's deaf have wildly different needs, right? The specific the way that what they see as their identity is going to be really different, and they might not feel like that larger umbrella of disability applies to them. Or Patrick, what you were just saying about having a learning disability or having ADHD, that maybe you don't want to be, I'm going to say in scare quotes, like lumped in with this other range of disabilities. I think there's also a fairly common problem where someone might have a physical disability and assumptions are made that they have other additional disabilities. So, I mean, I've heard this sort of as a joke from someone who was blind, and someone was yelling at them when they were talking to them, and like, I'm not deaf.
Right.
And so an assumption oftentimes that someone isn't as smart because, oh, there must be an intellectual disability that goes along with this physical disability I can see. So I think there's definitely stigma around that an assumption that someone's going to think, again in scare quotes, that you're worse off than you are, or that somehow disability as a term is too big, and that's not what someone wants to identify as.
Yeah, like as far as I go, I agree. I think the term itself is sort of very broad. Like, how I said, like, I have these various, I guess you would consider them to be disabilities, but I've never really considered myself to be disabled, because maybe it's just because, like, most of the time my life is just like anyone else's. although there definitely was a time where, you know, it wasn't, and it was very difficult because of my health problems.
Mhm.
And I think maybe during that time, if you asked me if I was disabled, I probably would have said yes. But now, since I'm no longer in that place, thankfully, my I probably wouldn't consider myself to be disabled. I guess the term itself to me sort of means like maybe somebody who needs assistance living everyday life, or maybe that's just my interpretation of it. I feel like everyone probably has their own interpretation
That's
of it.
pretty much the clinical definition. Is like,
So
what is the functionally limiting
yeah, that
component
was
of this person's life to be disabled is really the question.
yeah. So like I said, I think definitely I had to. There was a time for like a good at least 6 months where I had to be hooked up to a machine for 3 days a week for 4 hours in order to just stay alive. So, and then afterwards it was exhausting. Like I could barely do anything. I tried taking 2 classes. I was at a community college then. I tried taking 2 classes and I had to end up dropping one because I just couldn't handle it. It was just
Yeah.
so exhausting. And then, thankfully I was really lucky to get a transplant as quickly as I did. And I and then since then, my life has really gone back to normal, although maybe during COVID it wasn't. That was kind of I always thought it was kind of funny that after I had my transplant, I had to stay quarantined for a couple of months because I was immunocompromised. And then so I was just like, oh, so right when everything was back to normal for me is when COVID happens, and everyone was all complaining about sort of the isolation of it. I'm just thinking, well, yeah, this isn't anything new for me.
That's not fair. I'm so sorry, Noah.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine.
Janelle, you were gonna say something. I don't know if you're
Yeah.
still.
So I was gonna say, like, I feel like you both kind of touched upon this a little bit. There kind of seems to be, I don't want to say a hierarchy in disability, but kind of a hierarchy in disability, right? Depending on how high your needs are, the level of your needs are, and not wanting to be categorized as having a higher level need in some situations and cases, which might lead to someone not wanting to identify as a person with a disability. And the numbers that researchers are currently finding that people aren't identifying, although we know that 1 every 4 Americans adults have disabilities.
Or they identify and they have the privilege to identify in certain pockets of life and not in other pockets of life. In order to receive academic accommodations, you must identify with our office, but your friends may not know, or other people may not know, your work may not know, depending on sort of where you're at and what your pockets are in terms of how you choose. So if you have the privilege to choose to identify, that's certainly a component. I also have been hearing a little bit lately and talking with some students that some students who may live somewhere in like maybe the middle of a hierarchy don't want to be taking advantage of the system, whatever that means to them. To be asking for accommodations to them means taking advantage of a system, which is an interesting idea too when we think of stigma and kind of what comes up for that.
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of felt like that too. Like I sort of felt like, oh, I shouldn't sign up for the disability services because what I have isn't, say, as bad as somebody else's. I mean, my disability affects me less than maybe another person's does. And Actually, I thought it was interesting because my mom was talking to me about that the other day, of people taking advantage of it, and then I was sort of being a bit defensive, saying like, "Oh, so you mean so? How is it people taking advantage of it if it's available to them? How, like, if they have help that's available and they need the help, shouldn't they take the help that if they need it? That doesn't seem like taking advantage of anything to me. It seems like just common sense."
And it's really interesting that the language is take advantage, because in other contexts, that's a positive thing. Like, oh, I'm taking advantage of all the things that school has to offer for me, right? We frame that as a positive thing, right? When we send students off to school and say, make sure you go to some clubs and do these things, take advantage of all the world has to offer. But we also mean this very undercutting thing about like, oh, you're taking advantage of the system. And it's a very strange swap that happens there. And I think it's also tied to some people. I think there's a sizable group out there that thinks people are faking their disabilities, right? And so then there's that fear that folks with disabilities have, that they will be seen as faking or masking something. That's really troubling. And I honestly don't know where that comes from, that idea that people are faking things. That's a area I haven't really thought, but it's very strange and upsetting.
I forget the name of it, but there is some sort of mental, I don't know if it's a disorder or not, but it makes people think that they have a certain disability when they really don't. And so technically they're lying about it, but they really feel like they think that they have it. But it's so incredibly rare, and then people lying about it, it's so incredibly rare that, like, there's millions of people, like you said, 1 in 4 adults in the United States have a disability. So, I mean,
right.
So we're just supposed to, how many people are there? Like 300,
right.
300 million people. If half of them are adults, and then, a quarter of that, you have around close to around 100 million people that, I'm sure like 100 million people are definitely lying about it. That's ridiculous.
Right. But then the media is highlighting those cases, and so they stick with us.
Yeah.
Right? So there was a lot somewhat recently on, people bringing animals on airplanes, let's say, and trying to beat a system because they didn't want to pay a fee. So people are bringing their emotional support, like peacocks on an airplane, and those would get really highlighted in the news. Like the New York Times is writing on like the emotional support crocodile that showed up on the airplane and so forth. And that messes with an identity of somebody who maybe really requires an animal, somebody who has a service animal, who really requires the animal as a function of their ability to survive and be in the world and navigate life. It's an extension of their person. And so those get really magnified, and they do mess with the sense of what is the system and beating it and taking advantage of it.
I don't think you could have a crocodile though, because if you had a crocodile on a plane, the crocodile would eat everyone.
Okay, maybe I went too far, but I think people definitely read a story about an emotional support peacock. Like I'm pretty sure that was there. So maybe.
I think I remember that.
But the fact that that's the story that runs in the New York Times, and not the stories about airplane workers just ruining people's wheelchairs. That happens far more often than a quote fake emotional support animal. That's the story that that people have chosen to tell and retell. I think it maybe is also related to folks not understanding the sort of spectrum that so many disabilities exist on, and that some people who use wheelchairs need a wheelchair all the time. But some people who use wheelchairs are able to walk for short amounts, or are able to walk some days in the case of like someone with MS. And so it's this assumption that disability is always this one thing, and it always looks this exact way. And oh, wait, this person is in between these categories somehow. This person,
or they have a handicap placard, but they're walking that day. Those kinds of things. Yeah.
And I feel like that is about a bigger education for people about, okay, disability doesn't just look one way. It doesn't, even for one person, it doesn't look one way all the time necessarily. So I feel like that's a big hole in our education that maybe is partly contributing to some of the stuff we're talking about here.
I always say that people can have the same disability, but they can experience it completely differently.
Exactly. I think with the going back to like exaggerating, I think most people use their accommodations when they need it to what I've been described to, like in high school, to uh, what they've said to even out the playing field. I think is kind of how they describe when we were going through, kind of what accommodations you need. It's kind of, they're kind of like, we're kind of looking at these accommodations and do they level the field for you across the whole student body, to kind of rule out excessive accommodations like an emotional support peacock, So I don't think people do as much, at least not in my experience.
I would even say, in my experience, people tend to underutilize the resources available to them because they are trying to, again, fit in into as much as they can to prove that, they aren't, quote, different, right?
I definitely see that all the time, Janelle. And sometimes it's because they've been told they don't know that you don't actually need that extra time for that exam, or that's not necessary. And people who don't actually have the information about it. Or likewise, I see sometimes students that don't have a disability accommodation. Oh, well, why does that person get extra time? That's not fair to me. And there's just kind of a lack of understanding. Like, no, there's a reason. There's studies that show that actually if these folks get more time, they will do better, versus extra time isn't going to change things for other populations.
Right.
A profound misunderstanding of what those
Preparedness is
accommodations
preparedness. It just ends up being what do you need from there? So
and I know this, I'm hoping this kind of thing is rare, but I know my sister went to Suffolk University only for about a month because she signed up with the disability services, and then she gave the slip, I guess, to one of her professors, and the professor started just chastising her in front of the whole classroom, saying like, well, you don't look disabled to me, like that kind of thing. I was almost sort of like, in a way, bullying her for it, like,
and again,
it's strange. It's just like you don't know what happened to her, like,
right.
I mean, and also she shouldn't even have to say anything. You just, that's your job, is to just accept it. But yeah, I hope whoever that was got fired.
I'm so sorry that happened. That's definitely not okay, but it happens enough. I hate that it happens at all, but it happens enough that people are reluctant. Every other student in that class saw that interaction, and it just communicated to them that disability was not something that they could talk about freely in that course.
And your sister took that as her narrative now to decide about her identity from every one of these like touch points that happen about her identity. She now had to decide from that moment how she was going to feel about her identity and what she was going to do about it from there. And that's what happens to us, like for positive or for negative. We have touch points and we have to decide what we can do in terms of our feelings and our identity and our pride and all the different components of it too. So that's that's that nature versus nurture situation we're always kind of battling.
It just goes to show how much work we still have to do in order to create an inclusive, equitable environment for all.
Right.
I don't necessarily know if it is a disability, but I know when I was in high school, I was diagnosed with like clinical depression. However, I know for years at that point, I thought it was normal, and I didn't think it was a problem. So I know, I don't even know if that would count as a disability, I feel like. But my sister dealt with something similar, but in a way it was like even worse. So
I
the
think
fact
you're
that
putting that hierarchy out there with all the different categories of
maybe I
disability
am.
and what Janelle was saying is two different people with the same diagnosis, it's going to present really differently for them in terms of level of functioning in daily life. And, you know, mental health conditions are absolutely up there as one of the most complex that are the hardest to kind of figure out. And that because they're invisible, which we talk about a lot, is that they're invisible to others. And so, you know, figuring that out and how debilitating it can be is
yeah. Also, I do feel like the sort of faking when it comes to that, rather than other disabilities, it is extremely common. Like people will say they have depression when they aren't diagnosed with it. Like, I mean, in order,
it's really colloquial in our language right now to use certain terms that may not be, you know,
I'm very
had a panic attack
or whatever. Yeah. And it's to the point where, like, yeah, everyone has anxiety, but if you have like a problem with it, you're diagnosed with that. And I think that lots of people have problems when it's just sort of thrown around as kind of just like, you know, anything. I guess, like, it's almost to the point of saying that you're hungry, like, I'm anxious, or I'm depressed. Like it's that common now. And then people don't really understand I mean, there's a whole stigma against mental health to begin with anyways. So, and that doesn't even touch the surface of it.
I think that's a good point about also just in general, like what most people consider disability, and then also bringing in like identifying and whether people are going to like the factors that people kind of consider when identifying themselves as someone disabled is, you know, like, I don't want to say this because what if some people will come up to me and be like, well, especially for like hidden disabilities, or maybe you just were diagnosed with like ALS or something, it's not something you can see. So if you identify, people are going to ask, well, like, show me the notes, like, show me the proof that like you actually, you know, you're not doing this for a show.
Yeah, I mean, I think in cases where if it's just like anyone, it's easy to just say like that person, talking to that person or even being around them isn't worth my time if people are going to be like that. However, like, I guess if it was if you were like in a class, or if it was at your job or something and your boss or your teacher is saying that, then that's where it can definitely become problematic. Not that it isn't problematic when people will do that kind of thing in general, but I think it's when it's someone you have to be around, definitely it can be very difficult.
It can definitely be very difficult to face discrimination and stigma on a day-to-day basis, right? And so a question I have is, do you think it's important for people who have a disability to identify as a person with a disability? Even though they have to face stigma and
not an easy question, you know, it's okay to have.
I don't know.
I'm really, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Noah.
Oh no, that was all I was gonna say there.
I'm gonna say one more thing. I had this question on here because I once was part of a panel and someone asked me, if you had children and you can cure your disease, would you take that as an option? And I was like, my first instinct is yes, of course. Why would I want to have my children face hardship on a day-to-day basis, right? But then the person was like, but you're eliminating differences in the world. You're eliminating culture. You're eliminating like embracing differences.
Hmm.
And I was like, I understand your point 100%, but as a person who has lived with a disability my entire life and understands what comes with that and the barriers that come with that, I would still stick to my answer. That's where that question came from.
Yeah, I would definitely, personally, that I sort of have a lot to say about that because of the kidney disease I was born with. I pretty much, like, if I ever were to have, I mean, I'm not at the point in my life now where I'd try to have a kid or anything, but you know, maybe if it was like 15, 20 years from now, if I had a daughter, she would be pretty much, that chances of her having what I have would be nearly guaranteed. And again, like I don't think I could, I wouldn't want anyone to deal with what I've dealt with. I think it's more so, it's not being like you were saying, like, oh, you're sort of eliminating differences. I wouldn't really look at it like, I don't really look at it like that. I would say like it's extreme, like what I dealt with, having to pretty much I don't know, it's difficult to explain right now, but I'm just thinking like I wouldn't want to subject another person to that because it's extremely difficult for both physically and mentally. And so yeah, if I'm ever at that point in my life, it's going to be a very difficult, I'm going to have to make very difficult decisions. But I know for a fact that I couldn't in my right mind ever let anyone deal with what I have. So
I think it's an interesting conversation because I don't know. I think it depends on how you grew up. I think a lot of kind of my opinions of these certain topics is based on how I grew up, and you know, I'm neurodivergent and my parents aren't and all my siblings aren't, and I'm just happen to be the only one, and so they don't understand me. So it's kind of like I kind of like being different,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mhm.
and I don't think, I mean, I don't think having it passed on would be a bad thing. I think differences are good, but I understand where Noah and you are coming from, as you know,
yeah,
you live through it and it's something you wouldn't want someone else to live through. But I think when it comes to being not neurodivergent, it's a little different because it's not
Mhm.
necessarily health like deteriorating. It's just a difference in
yeah.
Right. There's like a pain
Yeah.
incurred kind of sick situation.
there's
Yeah, I
pain in the court,
completely
yeah.
agree. Like I have lots of friends who are autistic, and then I mean, I don't treat them any differently than I would a regular person without autism. I shouldn't say regular, I should just say a person without autism. Because to me, they are just regular people.
Mhm.
I don't really, yeah, they might act a little differently at certain times, but it doesn't, I mean, that shouldn't really matter. I feel like everyone acts differently in their own ways. We're all, people are unique, you know, we're all different. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So when I see things like Autism Speaks, that organization saying like, oh, how autism is like the worst thing ever, like they had some whole thing saying like they're trying to cure it, and then I think like
Mhm.
even if you could, then, but it's just like, would people even want that?
Mhm.
Because I don't know, I sort of forget, because read or heard about this a long time ago, but I know they had some sort of video that was extremely disgusting, saying that, you know, pretty much they almost said like, if kids would rather be dead, would be better off dead than they would be with autism, and that made me furious. And I think that would be like that for pretty much everyone.
So like
it was completely disgusting. Yeah.
Identifying with the positives of a disability can really help educate the society and the community. You know, and I think all the way back to what Bridget said in the beginning is sort of like the identifying with a disability. We have to think about like the internal version of identifying with a disability and how others look at us, and it's layered in both directions in terms of identity, which is why we thought this was an important topic to talk about today, because it's complicated.
Janelle, to come back to your question, I don't want to put it on people with disabilities to have to embrace that identity. If you do, awesome, but I don't feel like we should be asking people with disabilities to do more. I think we need to make a world that is going to be more inclusive and make it easier for people to want to identify, to choose that identity. But I'm very reluctant to suggest to anyone what kind of language they should use to refer to themselves. And if disability isn't a term that they want, I definitely am not at all going to be one to recommend even, you know, because we are in a world that discriminates. And so I think that it's a very, unfortunately, a very sound and reasonable decision to make. At the same time, it's weighted in so many ways, as you were talking about, Janelle, with like, and Jodi, about if you have the privilege to not choose that identity that someone won't know, versus folks who don't really have that option because their disability is more visible, or in some way that society will choose that identity for them anyway.
Right. Yeah. I feel like we could go for another hour, but we probably should wrap up. So Janelle is going to go for it with our closing question. And then maybe we just need to have like a part B of this conversation, or like C and D and E or something. I don't know. We'll find out, but let's see. Let's get our closure, I think.
All right. So after this conversation, what is a takeaway that will stick with you? And has anything changed about how you feel as a person with a disability or an ally about disability stigma? So two-part. Oh, Jodi,
I popped it in the chat because
Perfect.
it's a lot to answer. We'll just each take a turn to kind of share.
I think a takeaway that I have that'll stick with me from this conversation, I think like I always knew disability was a spectrum, and then within it there's spectrums, obviously. But I think also just within that there's a whole another spectrum of opinions. And I think that even as someone who is part of the community, I think I just have to be even more open than I already am, because there's different layers to it. And then I think I feel the same as I did before as a person with a disability. But regarding stigma, I think there's just more we need to do, and there's kind of like a longer road than I think I realized before.
Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, I feel sort of complicated when it comes to this kind of stuff, especially I'm just gonna admit that after I had my kidney transplant, I tried to stay away from thinking about that stuff as much as I possibly could, because it was a very extremely difficult experience to go through.
Sure.
So like I remember, I think I might have gotten a little bit upset because my mom might have posted something on Facebook about like being an organ donor. And I mean, maybe at the time I was upset. Now I'm not so. But then I think she asked me, like, why aren't you more involved in that? And then I did sort of feel bad about it, but I feel like, for one thing, it's not entirely who I am. I think it's important to be an organ donor. I think every person should sign up. It saves lives. And yes, I completely agree with it. But I think I sort of, after my experience, I sort of tried to avoid talking about it as much as I could. And then so sort of coming on here today to talk about it was kind of difficult for me emotionally. And I guess maybe I'm sort of playing into my own sort of what I think disability is, and I think maybe that's what I'm going away with, is we shouldn't think of it in one way. We might all have our own perspective on it, but we should be open-minded. We should be willing to listen to other people. And we should recognize that, these disability exists, and, problems arise because of that for many people. And it's important that, we give people the help that they need, just as we would anyone else. Even if a person wasn't disabled, if someone needs help, you help them. It's not that, never really been that complicated for me, I guess, as far as that goes. But
Thanks, Noah.
yeah.
Thank you.
For me, I'll really take away what Patrick and Noah and Janelle said about their experiences with disability. Like hearing your stories, hearing what you've experienced, I think is really at the heart of conversations like this. So, I'd love to be a part of more conversations, and definitely looking forward to listening to more episodes, because the more we hear these stories and experiences, the better our understanding of the world, the better we'll be able to hopefully make a more just and equitable community for everyone, right? To be inclusive of everyone.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much. Oh, that was our round of applause. It was quick this time. All right. That's it.